It always starts with something small, doesn't it? A little drip that eventually carves a canyon. For me, the drip was a folded piece of cheap paper tucked under the wiper blade of my meticulously maintained '67 Mustang, parked in its usual spot, number 27, a spot I'd considered mine for the better part of a decade. I lived in Serene Vista Condominiums, a name that, in hindsight, dripped with an irony so thick you could spread it on toast. Serene Vista was, on the surface, an oasis of beige stucco and obsessively trimmed hedges governed with an iron fist and a laminated rulebook by one Ms. Agnes Crabtree, our esteemed HOA president. Ms. Crabtree was a woman whose posture seemed permanently braced against a hurricane of perceived infractions, her voice a low, monotonous drone that could suck the joy out of a winning lottery ticket. She saw herself as the custodian of Serene Vista's exclusive character, which mostly translated to measuring the height of patio gnomes and issuing fines for incorrectly sorted recycling. My Mustang, a gleaming black beauty I'd poured countless hours and a not insignificant portion of my soul into restoring, was my pride. Spot number 27 was perfect for it, end of the row, so only one potential doordinger, shaded in the afternoon and conveniently close to the lobby elevator, a small mercy for my occasionally rebellious knee. It wasn't just a parking space, it was part of my routine, my small, well-ordered corner of the world. The notice, printed in an aggressive, hectoring font, informed me that spot number 27 was being redesignated for essential community vehicle overflow and short-term guest parking, effective immediately. As per a revised master parking allocation plan approved by the board, essential community vehicle overflow? We had precisely 0 community vehicles unless you counted Mr. Henderson's mobility scooter, which he parked in his living room. And guest parking was a barren wasteland on the far side of the complex, rarely more than 10% occupied. This wasn't a plan, it was a land grab. There was no prior warning, no community consultation, just the stark, impersonal decree. My first reaction was a sort of bewildered amusement. Surely, this was a mistake. A clerical error from the Crabtree administrative machine. Then, as the effective immediately part sank in, annoyance began to bubble, hot and acidic. This felt less like an administrative adjustment and more like a targeted eviction. I'd had minor skirmishes with Miss Crabtree before, a polite but firm letter from her regarding the unsuitably vibrant welcome mat I'd briefly experimented with. Another concerning the non-standard aroma of garlic I was apparently emitting whilst cooking, solved by me sending her a Tupperware of my lasagna, which, to my surprise, she'd accepted with a curt nod and no further comment. But this felt different. This felt like a deliberate poke in the eye. My Mustang deserved better. Mine deserved better. And frankly, after 10 years of diligently paying my exorbitant HOA dues, I deserved better than to have my parking spot summarily confiscated by fiat. The serenity of Serene Vista was, for me at least, officially shattered. The canyon carving had begun. My first port of call was, naturally, Ms. Crabtree herself. I found her holding court in the small, sterile community room, a space so devoid of personality it made a dentist's waiting room look like a carnival. She was lecturing poor Mrs. Albright on the precise angle her satellite dish was permitted to be installed, a protractor glinting ominously in her hand. I waited, trying to project an aura of calm, reasonable inquiry, though inside, a small, caffeinated badger of indignation was clawing at my composure. Ms. Crabtree, I began, once Mrs. Albright had scurried away, looking thoroughly chastened regarding this notice about spot #27. I held up the offending paper. She peered at it over the top of her severe, rectangular glasses, her expression unchanging, as if I'd handed her a particularly dull weather report. Ah, yes, Mr. Pringle. Spot number 27. Redesignated. Quite clear, I believe her voice was flat, each word delivered like a perfectly uniform paving slab. Well, no, actually, it's not quite clear why, I persisted, trying to keep the badger on its leash. I've been using that spot for nearly 10 years. It's ideally situated for my classic car, and frankly, for my knee, which isn't what it used to be. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Was it satisfaction? Mr. Pringle, she intoned, the board has determined that certain prime location spots are being, shall we say, underutilized by long-term single-vehicle residents. The new master parking allocation plan aims to optimize our communal resources for the benefit of all residents and their guests. Communal resources? It was my spot, or at least, the spot I'd come to understand was mine through long and uninterrupted usage. Optimize? I echoed. By making it harder for a long-term, dues-paying resident to park? How does that benefit anyone, apart from perhaps inconveniencing me specifically? The badger was definitely off its leash now, sniffing the air for confrontation. Ms. Crabtree drew herself up, her spine stiffening further, if that were even possible. The board's decisions are final, Mr. Pringle. We are not required to debate them with individual residents. If you have an issue with parking further away, there are several less desirable but perfectly adequate spaces available in Zone C, near the recycling dumpsters. Perhaps the walk would be invigorating for your knee. The sheer, unadulterated condescension was breathtaking. Zone C was a barren strip of asphalt at the ass end of the complex, notorious for collecting discarded fast food wrappers and the occasional stray cat fight. It was also a solid quarter-mile trek to my unit. My attempts to appeal to reason, to fairness, even to basic human decency, were met with a bureaucratic brick wall topped with razor wire. I spoke to a few other residents. Old Mr. Carmichael, who'd once had his prize-winning roses cited for being excessively thorny, commiserated but advised me to just let it go. She's like rust, son, he'd wheezed. She never sleeps, and she always wins a younger couple. The Hendersons told me they'd received a similar notice about their tandem spot being split because they only owned one car. They were fuming but felt powerless. It became clear that Miss Crabtree was on a bit of a power trip, rearranging the parking landscape of Serene Vista like some tin-pot dictator redrawing provincial borders. The frustration was immense. My beautiful Mustang was now relegated to the badlands of Zone C, and every trip to and from it was a small, simmering reminder of Miss Crabtree's arbitrary tyranny. But with every inconvenient step, with every glance at the now empty spot number 27, which, ironically, remained stubbornly vacant most of the time, essential community vehicle overflow, apparently being a mythical concept, a different kind of resolve began to harden within me. If Miss Crabtree wanted to play games with parking spots, then perhaps it was time I learned the rules of her game, and then perhaps changed them entirely. The anger didn't just dissipate. It distilled. It became a cold, clear fuel for action. Miss Crabtree had drawn a line in the asphalt, and I was damned if I was going to let her erase my part of the map so easily. My first step was to dive headfirst into the Mariana Trench of Serene Vista's governing documents, the CC and RS, the bylaws, the minutes of every HOA meeting for the past 5 years. My living room began to resemble a hoarder's den if the hoarder had a specific fetish for badly photocopied legal documents and passive-aggressive newsletters. I consumed gallons of coffee, my eyes burning, highlighting sections, making notes, cross-referencing clauses that seemed deliberately designed to induce narcolepsy. Most of it was the usual boilerplate nonsense about lawn maintenance and the approved shades of beige for window treatments. But then, buried deep within a subarticle of a forgotten addendum to the original master deed, I found it. A single, beautiful sentence that made my heart do a little jig. Individually designated parking spaces, as delineated on the filed condominium plan, are considered limited common elements appurtenant to and for the exclusive use of specific units and may be conveyed, sold, or leased between unit owners subject to board notification. Conveyed, sold, or leased. My spot number 27 hadn't been some nebulous privilege granted by the HOA. It was, or should have been, tied to my unit, or at least its usage rights clearly defined. Crabtree's redesignation was likely a gross overreach, probably based on a misunderstanding or a deliberate misinterpretation of her powers regarding unassigned common area parking versus deeded or exclusively assigned spots. This discovery was the first chink of light in the Crabtreean darkness. It suggested her authority wasn't as absolute as she believed, but exclusive use was one thing, outright ownership was another. I needed to know more. My next call was to a sharp, no-nonsense real estate lawyer, a woman named Ms. Anya Sharma, whom I'd used years ago when I bought my condo. I explained the situation, the notice, my research. She listened patiently, then asked me to send over my original purchase agreement and the section of the master deed I'd found. A day later, she called back. "Mr. Pringle," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike, "it's interesting. Your original agreement is a bit vague on spot number 27's specific legal status. It might have been an exclusive assignment rather than a deeded conveyance with your unit. However, the clause you found in the master deed is key. It confirms that some spots in Serene Vista are indeed separately deeded or conveyable assets. The critical question is, which ones? And are any currently available for purchase?" This was the turning point. The idea, initially a wild, almost comical fantasy, began to take root. What if I didn't just fight for spot number 27? What if I took control of the parking situation in a way Ms. Crabtree could never have anticipated? If spots were property, then property could be acquired. The thought sent a thrill, a mischievous, rebellious spark through me. I had a modest portfolio from some savvy investments my late father had guided me into years ago, a nest egg I'd always earmarked for a rainy day or a significant opportunity. The relentless reign of Ms. Crabtree's petty tyranny, combined with this unexpected opportunity, felt like the perfect storm. This wasn't just about getting my old spot back anymore. This was about making a statement. This was about deploying overwhelming, unexpected force. This was about buying the damn block, or at least, a significant, game-changing chunk of its parking. Ms. Crabtree thought she was playing checkers. I was about to unveil a chessboard where I owned half the squares. The plan, once a nebulous flicker of defiance, began to solidify into a concrete strategy. Ms. Sharma, intrigued by the sheer audacity of it, agreed to help navigate the legalities of purchasing individual parking spots within Serene Vista. Her first piece of advice was discretion. If Ms. Crabtree gets wind of what you're attempting before you've secured anything, she warned, she could try to obstruct you, perhaps by suddenly finding a forgotten bylaw or pressuring potential sellers. So, Operation Asphalt Acquisition would proceed under a veil of utmost secrecy. My first task was reconnaissance. I needed to identify which spots, if any, were actually available or might become available. This wasn't like browsing Zillow for houses. Parking spots, especially in a tightly controlled environment like Serene Vista, were rarely advertised openly. I started by subtly observing which spots seemed to belong to elderly residents who might be considering downsizing, which units were renter-occupied, where the owner might live elsewhere and not need their deeded spot. I made a mental map of the parking garage, cross-referencing it with the hazy knowledge I had of my neighbors. Then Ms. Sharma suggested a more direct, yet still discreet, approach, contacting a few select real estate agents who specialized in Serene Vista and similar condo complexes. She knew one in particular, a dapper, silver-haired gentleman named Julian Vance, who had a reputation for knowing everything about everyone in the local property market. Julian, when I met him for coffee, far away from Serene Vista, of course, listened to my plan with an expression that was initially one of polite skepticism, which slowly morphed into amused fascination. Buy up parking spots to make a point to your HOA president? He chuckled, adjusting his silk tie. Mr. Pringle, in my 30 years in this business, that's a new one. But I admire your panache, he confirmed Ms. Sharma's assessment. Yes, certain spots in Serene Vista were deeded and could be sold. They didn't come up often, but they did surface. Usually, Julian explained, it's when someone sells their unit and the buyer doesn't want or can't afford the extra for the deeded spot, so the seller might offer it to another resident. Or an estate sale. You need patience, and you need to be ready to move fast when one appears. He agreed to keep an ear to the ground for me, to discreetly inquire amongst his contacts. Meanwhile, I began to assess my financial readiness. This wouldn't be cheap. Prime parking spots in desirable locations could fetch a surprising sum. I reviewed my investment portfolio, considered reallocating some assets. The thought of liquidating a portion of the fund my father had so carefully built gave me pause. But then I imagined Ms. Crabtree's face when she realized she'd lost control of her precious parking fiefdom. The anticipated satisfaction was a powerful motivator. This was no longer just about rectifying an injustice. It was about strategic dominance. A quiet, well-funded coup d'etat executed one asphalt rectangle at a time. My workshop, usually dedicated to tinkering with my Mustang or woodworking projects, became a command center. Spreadsheets tracking potential spots, notes on unit owners, financial projections. It was a far cry from carburetors and camshafts. But the thrill of a complex project meticulously planned was surprisingly similar. Miss Crabtree was busy policing petunias. I was busy laying the groundwork for her parking Waterloo. The first breakthrough came sooner than I expected. Julian Vance called me about 3 weeks into Operation Asphalt Acquisition. "Arthur, my boy," he said, his voice conspiratorial. "I have a nibble. Unit 3B, Mrs. Periwinkle. Lovely old dear, moving into an assisted living facility next month. She has 2 deeded spots, number 12 and number 14, prime locations near the east entrance. Her nephew handling the estate is keen for a quick, uncomplicated sale of the spots separately if the unit buyer doesn't want both. Are you interested?" Was I interested? It was like asking a starving man if he fancied a steak. Spots number 12 and number 14 were not my beloved number 27, but they were excellent, easily accessible, and crucially, they were available. Absolutely, Julian, I said, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. What's the asking price? The price was steep, but within the parameters I'd set. Ms. Sharma handled the legalities with her usual efficiency, drafting the purchase agreement, ensuring the deeds were clean. The process was surprisingly straightforward, just like buying any other piece of real estate, albeit a very small, rectangular one. Within 2 weeks, I was the proud and somewhat giddy owner of parking spots number 12 and number 14. The feeling was intoxicating. I'd taken my first concrete step, laid my first 2 pieces on the board. I discreetly visited my new acquisitions, running my hand over the painted numbers, a grin plastered across my face. They were mine. Unassailably, legally mine. Ms. Crabtree couldn't touch them. My next target was closer to home. Mr. Henderson, my long-suffering neighbor whose tandem spot had been arbitrarily split by Ms. Crabtree because he and his wife only owned 1 car, had been grumbling for weeks. His other half of the spot, now designated #42B, sat empty and forlorn. I approached him cautiously. "George," I said one afternoon, "about that spot of yours, #42B, I know the HOA has been a pain. If you were ever thinking of formally severing it, selling the deed if it's separate, I might be interested." George looked at me, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes, followed by a mischievous smile. "You thinking of starting a collection, Arthur?" he asked. "Something like that," I admitted. It turned out his tandem spot was indeed 2 separately conveyable deeded portions. He was more than happy to sell me the rights to #42B for a very reasonable sum, mostly, I suspect, to spite Ms. Crabtree. "Just knowing she can't mess with it anymore will be worth it," he cackled as we shook hands. So, spot #42B joined my growing portfolio. Then came a stroke of luck. An email circulated from the HOA management company, a rare occurrence, announcing an online auction for 3 surplus administrative spots in the lower garage. Spots that had apparently been forgotten in some dusty corner of the HOA's asset register. They weren't prime, but they were deeded. I suspected Ms. Crabtree, in her infinite wisdom, was trying to raise some capital for one of her beautification projects. Rumor had it she wanted to replace all the perfectly functional lobby benches with ones made of sustainably sourced artisanal driftwood. I bid aggressively, anonymously, and secured all 3. My collection was now up to 6 spots. I was becoming a parking baron, a clandestine asphalt emperor. The beauty of it was the silence. Ms. Crabtree remained blissfully unaware, busy drafting new regulations about the approved decibel levels for wind chimes. She had no idea that the ground beneath her feet, or at least the parking garage beneath the building, was slowly, irrevocably shifting in my favor. Each signed deed, each wire transfer was a quiet act of rebellion, a satisfying click of a chess piece moving into a strategic position. The momentum, once established, began to build. Julian Vance, now fully invested in my unorthodox quest and clearly enjoying the cloak and dagger aspect of it, became an invaluable ally. He had a network that reached into every nook and cranny of Serene Vista's property market. He'd call with hushed enthusiasm, "Arthur, Unit 5G, owner relocating to Arizona, has a premium-covered spot, number 33, willing to part with it separately if we move quickly," or heard a whisper that the developer still technically holds the deeds to 2 unassigned spots in the West Wing, remnants from the original construction. Might be persuaded to sell to avoid ongoing nominal tax liabilities. Each lead was pursued with quiet determination. Ms. Sharma's office became accustomed to processing the paperwork for Pringle parking acquisitions, as her paralegal cheekily started calling them. I liquidated more of my investment portfolio, the initial pang of using my father's carefully curated funds now replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't a frivolous expense, it was an investment in peace of mind, in justice, and, let's be honest, in the exquisite satisfaction of outmaneuvering a petty tyrant. I was careful to vary the purchasing entities where possible, using my full name for some, a small, discreetly named LLC I'd set up for others, just to avoid raising immediate red flags on the HOA's radar if they ever bothered to look at transfer records, which I doubted they did with any diligence. My block wasn't a literal city block, of course, but I focused my efforts on the entire North Garage sector, the one closest to my unit and containing my old beloved spot number 27. It comprised about 30 spots in total. My goal became to acquire as many of these as humanly and financially possible. Some owners were unwilling to sell, their spots too precious or tied umbilically to their units. I respected that. But a surprising number, when presented with a fair, no-nonsense cash offer, were amenable. An elderly couple moving to a retirement community with no car, happy for the extra funds. A young professional who primarily cycled to work and saw his spot as a dormant asset. An out-of-state investor who rented his unit unfurnished and had no use for the associated parking. One by one, spots number 19, number 24, number 26, and then, oh sweet victory, spot number 27 itself came onto the market via an estate sale. The heirs lived out of state and just wanted to liquidate assets quickly. I paid a premium for number 27, more than it was objectively worth, but the sentimental and strategic value was immeasurable. Standing there, deed in hand, looking at the faded white numerals of 27 on the concrete, I felt a profound sense of triumph. I had reclaimed my territory, but I didn't stop there. By the time my acquisition spree began to slow, primarily due to a dwindling supply of willing sellers in my target zone, I had amassed a staggering total of 11 parking spots in the north garage. 11. More than a third of the entire sector. I owned a veritable archipelago of asphalt. And still, Ms. Crabtree remained oblivious, her attention consumed by a fierce debate over the permissibility of displaying decorative flags during non-federal holidays. The silence was about to be broken, and the sound would be the glorious, metaphorical screech of her authority grinding to a halt. The moment of revelation wasn't a grand, theatrical confrontation in the community room, at least not initially. It began subtly, as most things do in Serene Vista. I decided it was time to mark my territory, not aggressively, but unmistakably. For each of my 11 spots, I commissioned small, elegant, professionally made signs. Reserved P. Pringle private property. They were tasteful, in muted colors, and adhered perfectly to the HOA guidelines regarding minor aesthetic modifications to limited common elements by the deed holder. I installed them myself one quiet Saturday morning. The visual impact was immediate. A significant swathe of the north garage now bore my name. The first inkling that Ms. Crabtree had noticed came not as a direct accusation but as a confused email from the HOA management company to all residents of the north garage sector inquiring if anyone had information regarding the sudden proliferation of unauthorized signage. I replied politely, attaching copies of the relevant deeds and the HOA bylaw pertaining to signage on private deeded property. I CC'd Ms. Sharma just for good measure. The response was a deafening silence for 2 days. Then, on Tuesday evening, my doorbell rang with an insistent, almost frantic rhythm. I knew, even before I opened it, who it would be. Ms. Agnes Crabtree stood on my doorstep, her face a mottled pork puce, a color I hadn't previously known her complexion was capable of achieving. She was clutching a printout of my email, her hand trembling slightly. "Mr. Pringle," she hissed, her voice several octaves higher than its usual monotonous drone. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" "Ms. Crabtree," I said calmly, leaning against my doorframe. "To what specific outrage are you referring? The perfectly legal signage on my privately owned property? Or perhaps the fact that I own said property?" Her eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual suspicion, were wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. You bought them? All those spots? 11 spots? You can't do that." "Actually, Ms. Crabtree, I can. And I have. They're called deeded limited common elements, as per Article 7, Section B, Subsection 4 of our esteemed master deed, freely conveyable between unit owners. I have the deeds all properly registered. Would you care to see them?" I gestured vaguely towards my coffee table where a neat stack of legal documents sat. She looked as if I'd just offered her a plate of live scorpions. But why?" she stammered, the fight visibly draining out of her, replaced by a dawning horror. "Why would anyone need 11 parking spots?" I allowed myself a small, slow smile. "Well, Ms. Crabtree, it all started when the board, in its infinite wisdom, decided to redesignate my perfectly adequate spot number 27 for essential community vehicle overflow. I found that rather inconvenient. So, I decided to ensure my future parking needs and perhaps the parking needs of a few select friends were well and truly covered. You might call it proactive resource management. A concept I believe the board is rather fond of." Her jaw worked silently for a moment. The full implication of my actions seemed to be crashing down upon her. She had tried to exert absolute control over one small piece of asphalt and in doing so had inadvertently triggered a response that had wrested a significant portion of her parking dominion entirely from her grasp. The Pew's color deepened. This is an abuse. It's against the spirit of the community. We'll pass a new rule. We'll limit the number of spots one resident can own. I chuckled softly. You could try, Ms. Crabtree. But I suspect Ms. Sharma, my lawyer, would have a field day with any attempt to retroactively confiscate or devalue legally acquired private property. It tends to be rather frowned upon, legally speaking. Besides, imagine the precedent. What next? Limiting the number of bathrooms a unit can have? The number of windows? She stared at me, speechless, her carefully constructed world of rules and regulations crumbling around her. The Empress of Parking had no asphalt. The fallout from Ms. Crabtree's doorstep meltdown was, to put it mildly, spectacular. She did indeed call an emergency HOA board meeting, the agenda cryptically titled Urgent Matter Concerning Parking Resource Allocation and Potential Misuse of Common Elements. I wasn't invited, naturally, but Julian Vance, my real estate agent ally, had a friend on the board, a quiet, perpetually exasperated accountant named Arthur Jenkins, no relation, thankfully, who provided a blow-by-blow account. Apparently, Ms. Crabtree had stormed into the meeting, demanding that the board take immediate action to rectify Mr. Pringle's outrageous and selfish monopolization of community assets. She proposed a new bylaw limiting residents to 2 deeded spots, with any excess to be surrendered to the HOA for equitable redistribution, according to Jenkins. The HOA's retained lawyer, a Mr. Southers, who attended via speakerphone, had listened patiently to Ms. Crabtree's tirade. When she finally wound down, there was a long pause before Mr. Southers cleared his throat and stated in a dry, unequivocal tone that any attempt to forcibly divest a resident of legally purchased, deeded property without fair market compensation would likely result in a very expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful lawsuit against the HOA. He also gently pointed out that passing a new rule and attempting to apply it retroactively was a legal minefield they should avoid at all costs. Ms. Crabtree, Jenkins reported, had turned an even more alarming shade of puce and had begun to sputter about activist lawyers and the erosion of community values. The board, however, particularly Jenkins and 2 other members who had long chafed under Crabtree's autocratic rule, saw the writing on the wall. They were not keen on bankrupting the HOA to fight a battle they were almost certain to lose, especially one precipitated by Crabtree's own initial overreach concerning my spot number 27. The motion to create a new spot limitation bylaw died a quiet death, lacking a second. Ms. Crabtree's authority, so absolute just weeks before, had suffered a mortal blow. The news of my parking empire and Crabtree's impotent fury spread through Serene Vista like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. A few residents, undoubtedly those who had coveted some of the spots I'd acquired, grumbled about hoarding, but the vast majority, especially those who had themselves been on the receiving end of Crabtree's petty tyrannies, were privately, and sometimes openly, gleeful. I became a sort of folk hero, Pringle the parking pundit, the man who'd taken on the HOA dragon and won. My Mustang was now comfortably ensconced in spot number 27, its gleaming black paint reflecting my quiet satisfaction. The other 10 spots? I left a couple empty just because I could. I offered one to old Mr. Carmichael, free of charge, so he wouldn't have to trek to Zone C anymore. I leased 2 more at very reasonable rates to the Hendersons, who were expecting their first child and now needed a second car. Miss Crabtree, whenever she saw me, would glare daggers. But there was nothing she could do. Her attempts to control the parking in the north garage were utterly stymied. She had tried to take one, and in doing so had lost all power over 11. The irony was as delicious as the lasagna I no longer felt obliged to send her. The power dynamic in Serene Vista had fundamentally shifted, one deeded parking spot at a time. The sweet taste of victory was less about gloating and more about the quiet hum of restored order. An order I had defined, not Miss Crabtree. My Mustang gleamed in spot number 27, a black pearl in its rightful oyster. The reserved P. Pringle private property signs on my other 10 spots were small, tasteful monuments to due diligence and strategic rebellion. Miss Crabtree's reign of parking terror in the north garage was definitively over. She still prowled the halls, of course, clipboard in hand, but there was a noticeable deflation in her demeanor, a distinct lack of her former imperial swagger, especially when her gaze fell upon my section of the garage. Her attempts to rally support for new, restrictive parking bylaws had failed spectacularly, with even her former acolytes on the board now wary of provoking further legal battles or, perhaps, further Pringle-esque acquisitions in other sectors. The HOA meetings became slightly less tense, though Ms. Crabtree still managed to find new battlegrounds. The appropriate length for decorative pathway lighting cords became a particularly fraught topic for a while. But her authority had been visibly and perhaps irrevocably chipped. For my part, I tried to be a benevolent parking despot. As mentioned, Mr. Carmichael now had a prime spot. His old bones spared the long walk from the complex's nether regions. The Hendersons were immensely grateful for their 2 affordable, convenient spots, especially with a baby on the way. I even leased one spot to a young doctor who worked unpredictable hours at the nearby hospital and desperately needed reliable, close-in parking. I charged them all a nominal fee, just enough to cover the extra HOA dues associated with the spots, turning a small profit that I mentally earmarked as my Crabtree Aggravation Compensation Fund. One spot, number 19, which happened to have a particularly good view of the route Ms. Crabtree took on her morning constitutional, I left conspicuously, defiantly empty. Every time she walked past it, I imagined it served as a silent, asphalt reminder of her strategic blunder. The ripples of my parking coup spread through the community. Other residents, seeing that the HOA wasn't an unassailable monolith, began to push back, albeit more modestly, against other petty rules. There was a sudden resurgence of unsuitably vibrant welcome mats, a quiet flourishing of non-standard aroma cooking. It was a small, suburban velvet revolution sparked by a parking dispute. Ms. Crabtree's standing took a significant nosedive. Whispers about her competence, her judgment, even her continued suitability as president began to circulate. The aura of fear she had so carefully cultivated was replaced by a sort of weary disdain. She had overplayed her hand, and the entire community had seen her bluff called in spectacular fashion. My investment, both financial and emotional, had paid off in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just about the convenience of good parking. It was about reclaiming a sense of agency, about proving that even a seemingly entrenched system of petty bureaucracy could be challenged and defeated with a little bit of ingenuity, a healthy dose of righteous indignation, and, admittedly, a decent chunk of available capital. Life in Serene Vista gradually settled into a new equilibrium. Ms. Crabtree, though still technically president, was a diminished figure. Her pronouncements were met with less fear and more polite skepticism. The HOA board, sensing the shift in the wind, began to assert a more collective and considerably more reasonable form of governance. The era of arbitrary decrees seemed to be drawing to a close. My 11 parking spots in the north garage became an accepted, if slightly eccentric, feature of the community landscape. I continued to manage my little parking empire with a light touch, ensuring the spots were used by those who genuinely needed them or appreciated the convenience, while always keeping spot number 27 sacrosanct for my Mustang. The Pringle parking precedent, as some wags called it, did have a lasting effect. The HOA became far more cautious about meddling with anything that even remotely resembled a resident's property rights. The master deed was consulted with a new reverence, and the HOA lawyer, Mr. Suthers, found his opinions suddenly carrying a great deal more weight. It turned out that educating the enforcers on the actual limits of their power was a remarkably effective way to encourage more reasonable behavior. Sometimes, new residents, hearing a garbled version of the Great Parking War of Serene Vista, would approach me with a mixture of awe and amusement. "Are you the guy who bought all the parking spots?" they'd ask. I'd usually just smile and say, "I just made sure I had enough room for my car and a few for friends." The truth, of course, was a little more complex, a story of frustration, research, strategic investment, and the profound satisfaction of turning an antagonist's own tactics against them. Ms. Crabtree never directly acknowledged her defeat, never offered an apology for the initial confiscation of spot number 27. But every time I saw her avert her gaze as she passed my row of reserved P. Pringle signs, I knew. She knew. And that, in its own quiet way, was apology enough. The lesson, I suppose, is that sometimes fighting fire with fire isn't the answer. Sometimes it's about buying the fire station, the hydrants, and all the water in the municipal supply. When faced with an opponent who believes they control all the pieces on the board, the most effective strategy can be to simply buy the board itself. My Mustang never had to endure the indignity of Zone C again. And Serene Vista, while still far from truly serene, became a slightly more reasonable and considerably more interesting place to live. All thanks to a single, ill-advised parking notice and the stubborn refusal of one resident to simply move his car.